Yep.
We are on. I don't know if we have to clap, but we did. Hello, church. This is your pastors here with session 4 of our Sunday school material about identity. We've been digging into these theological questions of identity. Who is God who creates the church, and who are we as the church before God? We've been answering those 2 questions with 3 dimensions of identity, and now we're in this one where we understand ourselves as members of God's household with a place at God's table, as being in God's home somehow, the children of God in God's home. We discover in that we really do have a unique place at God's table. We belong together at God's table and in God's household, but to do that means we really begin to become aware of each other, of God, and of neighbor, and that is a gift, it's a challenge, and it requires growth for all of us as we become more aware. One of the things that we said as we think about who is God who creates the church, we said God is the God of resurrection to life in the midst of death. God of resurrection to life in the midst of death. The Spirit brings life out of places of deep brokenness. And so we're thinking about what that means to be part of God's home when God is this God who brings life out of death. That's what homemaking looks like in God's home. And this chapter is full of that, and we're trying to hone in on a few specific areas. This one is where we'll start, I think.
I think one of the questions that really came to my mind as I read this was I really wanted a clearer definition of what the actual difference was between housekeeping and homemaking. You talk a lot about both of them, but I really could not discern what the main difference was. So could you give us more of what it means between housemaking and homemaking?
Housekeeping and homemaking. Yes, I think we can, and you're right. I think it's kind of assumed and not nearly implicit enough. The best way I know how to tell the difference is a story that happened at another church. I got called over to a beautiful, fine home in the best part of town, one of our greatest families in the church. They were just in crisis, and when I walked in the door, they didn't even open the door. I opened the door myself and walked in. A beautiful living room, white carpet, white couches. The children were sitting like little statues on the couches, watching Mama and Daddy have a horrendous fight. They were just screaming at each other like you really couldn't believe. And Mama was crawling around on the floor cleaning the baseboards with a toothbrush. And her husband was just screaming at her. She was screaming at him. And I overheard Daddy say, "Why are you cleaning?" And his wife said, "I don't know what else to do." She was just crying. "I don't know what else to do. The only thing that seems to make you happy is a clean house. I clean so that you'll be happy. Surely there is more to us than this, but we don't know each other anymore. So I don't know. I don't know." And that moment is burned in my mind as I think about the difference between housekeeping and homemaking. The same thing happens in the church. You can't really have homemaking without housekeeping, but you can sure have housekeeping without homemaking. And in that particular situation, in that particular family, there was not home in that beautiful house, that beautiful, immaculately kept house. There was no home there because there was not enough love in that place. And that's where homemaking really becomes real. It's when the love comes out. You're able to experience love when you are at home and experiencing home. The same thing happens in the church. Does that help a little bit?
So it's kind of like housekeeping is more the things that we have to do to make sure this place is not necessarily just immaculate and ready for people to come on any given day, but it's also doing things like checking the bulletin, making sure that the toilets are clean, making sure that everything is ready for the day. So I guess my question is, where does it become homemaking?
Yeah, that's a powerful question. When does our housekeeping give way to homemaking? And to realize that we do have to do housekeeping in the church so that God can make God's home in the church. God can make God's home anywhere, but it sure helps when the stage is set for that work. Zach, I think you had a question for us to take up.
Yes. Well, as you think about this difference between homemaking and housekeeping, we want you to discuss in your classes the differences between those two, and maybe make a list of some of those things that we do as a church that are housekeeping, and another list of those things that are homemaking. That way in which we become more aware of one another, we experience that spirit that comes into those difficult places in our lives. And so make those lists, and then if you have time, maybe start to think about where we as a church having both housekeeping and homemaking happening at the same time, or where are we just experiencing one or the other?
Yeah, that's good. Good conversation. We'll take a break and be back with you shortly.
Is that okay? Sit down and join us at the table.
Okay.
Welcome back. We hope you had a good discussion about the differences between homemaking and housekeeping, and maybe got to some of those conversations about where that's happening in our local church. As we move on, we want to continue thinking about those things, and there was a story that you shared, Drew, about a particular meeting that you had, and it got into those questions of homemaking and the things that come up when we start that process of homemaking. We become really aware of one another. And so would you tell that story for everybody?
Yeah, I think anytime God starts to make God's home in our midst, we find that in that home we become very aware of each other, of God, and of our neighbor, and who our neighbor is. But that story is such a painful story. From my time in ministry, it's probably the most painful thing that's happened yet in the practice of ministry. We had a wonderful trustee chairman, again at another church, who was just a really gifted visionary leader, and he was running out ahead, helping us get to places where we needed to go, helping us make difficult decisions, organizing the church, doing a lot of housekeeping so that we could actually experience God's homemaking, doing a great job. But he began to make the wrong people mad. He could be a little rough around the edges, and so full disclosure, it was sometimes there was that. But ultimately, some of the folks that he was irritating began to really work against him and stir up a lot of conflict, and even made accusations about his character and the nature of his work and what he was really trying to do, and not what he was actually trying to do, or what he allegedly was trying to do. And this conflict just got worse and worse, and every time somebody came to me, I'd say, go talk to him, and I think you'll find that that's not the case at all, that he really is praying about this and helping us lead into God's movement in our church. And they just would not do that. Instead, they would stand on the sidelines and throw rocks at him. And so finally, I called a meeting, got them all in the same room. I thought I was doing this with that biblical model of conflict resolution. Had our lay leader with me, had communion right in the middle of the table. I thought, okay, we're going to just get all this stuff on the table, work it out, and have communion together, and sing Kumbaya before it's over. That's not what happened. We got in the room, and it got ugly. It got ugly in a hurry. And oh my goodness, the hurtful things that were said still are causing hurt and pain in that congregation. We lost some people. They left the church over it. A person that I was very close to, we went through a season of great distance because of the way that was handled. And what I discovered is we became very aware of each other in those moments. God was with us, and we were becoming very aware of each other, but we did not like what we saw. Didn't like it at all. And the meeting kind of broke up, and the trustee chairman disappeared for 2 years from the church. After that, he resigned. And the lay leader and I were sitting in the room looking at the communion elements, and he just said, we're not ready to love each other. We're not ready to love each other. And it broke my heart, and still does to this day, because I feel like I set that up, and it was just a disaster. That's what that looked like in that particular situation.
We're not ready to love one another.
Right.
really hard statement. And to experience that, I appreciated that you know, after you told the story in our reading, you went on to talk about how perhaps I could have listened to the real hurts. You know, and you named the church is changing. Buildings need help. We're embarrassed that we haven't taken care of these things. We're not ready to talk about what comes next. That's really hard stuff. And I appreciated that you named them, because too often we let them sit under the surface, and we let that become the stumbling block for us.
Right.
We allow that this idea that, hey, our church is changing, our church is growing. While it's a wonderful thing, it's scary because it's change, and nobody really likes change. The other part of this, though, that you don't mention is sometimes loving one another means loving one another through our disagreements.
Right.
Loving one another through those difficult moments when we're not perfect.
Right.
You know, when we just roll through things because we're trying to help move the church to a new place. So I guess the question that we have for you as you go into the rest of your class together is, where are the places in our church where we really need to make home rather than just keeping home? And then the next question is, what is the work that we have to do to help move us from just keeping home to actually making home?
Take some time and think through those things with your facilitator. Where are the places that we need God to make God's home among us, that we're waiting and anxious for that, and then what's keeping us from doing that? Take some time to think about that. Your facilitator will wrap up the class for today. We just have these 2 videos for today. Next Sunday, we'll finish things up with our final dimension of identity and this call to mission and service in the world. Thank you very much. Hope you have a good rest of your class.
Good job. Good job.